And people know that. They know it's not real, so you're drawing attention to the fact that they're being fooled. And one thing I love about the Tauntauns is that it's thrown away. It's almost as if when you do close or medium close-ups of us you're holding a piece of the Tauntaun's neck, almost like all those John Wayne shots, where you see a piece of the horse's head, but you really don't think about it. Now, I was looking at nothing but the Tauntauns, but as I've seen it 4 times now, it sort of fades into the background. It's just another one of the creatures.
Explain what the Tauntaun is.
The Tauntaun is a beast on Hoth, the ice planet, which is an animal that's able to withstand the really cold temperatures, and it's ridden like a horse, and I guess you'd compare it to sort of like a llama or a camel of some sort. What I love is that you wonder what sort of sounds they're going to create for...
Well, it was...
And that's you can't do it. But Ben Bird, who does it, there was such personality there when the first one comes over the hill. I don't know because I didn't see it last night, but there was like laughter. It was like whoa, and it's rabbit, and right there it has a personality immediately that they're not particularly bright. But they're, sort of...
They work hard.
And they're good beasts of burden that you can't help but feel affection for.
When you were standing on the nose of the X-Wing in the bog of Dagobah...
Yes.
We're using that in our magazine as the center poster. What were you... R2-D2 is the navigational droid in the back. I thought it was a nice effect of them making him gray in space when you were traveling to... Dagobah, when you're going and you took it off, you put it on manual controls and flew it himself. In space, he was gray. He wasn't blue. There was no colors. He lost his color.
Oh, see, I didn't notice that.
Okay, well, but what was when you were landed on the thing? That's the ultimate. You're on a dead planet, or you have no sophisticated forms of technology, but there was life forms. You were in a bog and you were standing on the nose, and to me, it was the most empathetic shot. Well, I saw you when we saw the colors still advanced. That we saw you crashed on a snowy plain with Chewbacca covered with snow, which was unusual. But that was the most poignant of all. You stuck in this bog.
Yeah. Well, the way I felt about it is like I've really gone out on a limb. Let's face it. Not only am I in the military, but I'm one of the officers, and to disobey orders, that's like in real army, that's treason. You could be shot for that. So I had a real stake in whether or not what I felt deep down was right. When I crash into the bog planet and see what it is, I just felt like it's like when your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere. It's that, oh boy, what am I going to do now?
Yeah, right. We heard a funny story about the bog that when the technicians prepared it all to show to Lucas for him, it's okay, they threw old tires and Coke cans and everything.
They did. And there were styrofoam coffee cups. It was something that could be brushed out in a second with a...
The American bog.
Yeah, the American... Well, it looks like, there have been visitors.
Mark, were you worried at the beginning of Star Wars that this would lumber you, as far as other roles were concerned, that you'd always be thought of as Luke Skywalker?
No, just the opposite. I thought when Star Wars came out, it was such a great success that I would be inundated with offers, which I was, but they were either all-star disaster films or, sort of steamy window drive-in movies. In other words, nothing... anybody that wanted me simply for my name and not to come into the office and see if I was right for the part were usually not good movies. And the really good movies I still had to go after, and I found in retrospect that after it, things became much more difficult, that they wouldn't see me for Midnight Express because I was in Star Wars, and they wouldn't see me for Breaking Away because I was in Star Wars. And I figure if I go out for it and then I don't get it, and I've met the director or read for him, well, that's fair, because I've had my shot at it. When they won't see me at all, that's...
And they wouldn't see you?
No. Well, not even a meeting. But as it turned out, Brad Davis and Dennis Christopher were both excellent, so you can't begrudge their success. It's just, had I been Richard Thomas, I probably wouldn't have been able to do Star Wars. You know what I mean? If I'd been famous going in for this, I wouldn't have gotten this.
What about your character? Did that make you shaky?
Oh yeah, I mean
when you were doing
I smashed my nose and
Corvette? Was it
no, it was a BMW. It was my own car.
off the road?
I was on a deserted freeway and I was going really fast and not knowing. It was about 6:30 in the evening, 6:45, and I was playing. What's the music? It goes da 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 da, and it was a brand new car. Those things go much faster because I used to have a Mazda, and when you got over 60, you knew you were going fast. So it was really deserted, and I realized, oh my God, I took the wrong freeway. I was way out in the boonies. I saw my exit coming off.
Where was it?
When? Where? In Southern California.
And when?
Early 77, I think January 11th, I think. But I saw my off-ramp coming up real quickly and just tried to negotiate like 4 lanes right at once. I thought instead of going beyond and getting off the freeway and then coming around. Now the only thing I can be thankful for is that I didn't hurt anybody. That's something I would have had to live with, but I just smashed the heck out of my nose and my cheekbone. I fractured both of them.
Off the road?
Yeah, and tumbled and went down. I don't know. I wasn't conscious.
Because I was thinking the whole time when I was watching you in the fluid yesterday, they didn't do the interrogation scene where you were raving about what you said when you were in the fluid.
Oh, that's right. You read the book then.
Yeah. But I thought of all the times when you were sitting with your face cut, it must have really...
It was eerie. Yeah, it was really eerie. And he used a lot of like the real scars to build upon. But funny that in that fluid, I mean, there was a whole scene.
Yeah, right.
And I was in the background, so that I spent days. And it was very peaceful. Yeah, it was very peaceful because you'd get in there and it was like you were floating and your mind would go away. Because most of the time I was supposed to be just unconscious. And it was really, there were a lot of really strange shooting things in this movie that I'd never done before. And
probably didn't use it. I was really amazed at that because I thought that was a pivot point for the plot. They just snapped out of it. So that, and the other amazing thing was the droid that was operating on you with that cheap 1948 Electro Voice microphone.
I know.
That was dynamite.
Well, the thing is, that to me is why we're different, is because they're brave enough. You go, wait a second, this looks like the same microphone I gave a speech for student body.
That's right.
So, in the trailer, in one of the trailers, that scene that was cut with Carrie. I have a semi-love scene with her that was cut, but there's that sort of Herbert Lom Phantom of the Opera mask. Now that's in one of the trailers because at that point that scene was still in the movie.
Mark, obviously, being in Star Wars didn't prevent you from what I understand is one of the definitive, brilliant war films of all time, Big Red One, with Lee Marvin. Can we talk about that?
We can talk about that. The Big Red One is... I always wanted to work with Sam Fuller because he makes that really particular kind of film, whether it's a gangster film or a newspaper story or a war movie. And I read it and I thought, well, I'd rather go see this than be in it. And I went, because I have a lot of respect for Sam Fuller, so I thought, well, I can take the time to meet the guy and at least tell him why I didn't want to do it, because I liked the script. I just didn't want to do it. I mean, spending my whole summer in Israel in World War II fatigues recreating the Battle of the Bulge is not my idea of a good time. And plus I was scared of Lee Marvin, and I thought, oh, I don't know, I'll be overpowered, and I just don't think I should. But I went and was totally entranced by him, and knew that I had to do it. But frankly, it's been 2 years, it's been recut by different people as the company changes hands. So much of it's cut now, they've added a narration by Robert Carradine. I saw it once. It's not the film that I signed to do. I just have to see it one more time to know what I feel about it. They cut out all of the romantic stuff I had with Stéphane Audran, that French actress, which one of the reasons I really wanted to do it. And you can't judge a movie that you've been in by seeing it one time. So I want to see it again, but from what I understand, it's entered in Cannes. I couldn't go to Cannes because I'm here. But Sam's going to Paris, even though they took the film away from Sam Fuller, which they did. They took it away from Sam, but I figure if Sam's going to Paris to promote it, that's his vote of confidence, so I'm going too.
Lee Marvin was saying that, as far as he was concerned, it was the most exciting one-on-one thing about a sergeant and his individual relations with the single unit.
I hope, yeah, I think that does come across very strongly. But again, it's not an unusual story. This happens all the time to actors. I need outside input because now I'm too close to it, and it's hard to be objective about it. But I have the highest hopes for it. Sometimes we could only use Frank for a short period of time, so we did all of Yoda's close-ups and all the over-the-shoulders that we could get, and then he went away, and I did my scenes with an object that was about his height, but not manipulated, not articulated. It just stood there.
What was that like to do?
Well, I mean, it was like breaking down acting into the most technical sort of. Yeah, I mean, it was a real test for me. And a lot of the times, since the manipulators were buried and far away, I didn't hear what he was saying. They had a radio mic in my ear for a couple of the scenes, but he usually went out, and I would have to sort of wait until I give him a period of time to get his line in. In my own mind, I'd think his line, no, I'm learning what you've learned, but I've learned so much. No, you haven't learned anything. It was like, it was like I sort of, and then playing with R2 is like a Bob Newhart routine. What's that you say, Mrs. Feddersen? You say that your car is just, that's rough stuff. And with Yoda, it was the supreme test. I mean, I'm amazed when it's cut together. It really looks like we're carrying on a conversation because it was done in so many different ways. You weren't sure whether this Yoda was a robot, or is this one a puppet, or is this one on strings? There were so many different ones. And there was a guy in a suit, not for the face, but in the long shot when he gestures with his flashlight. So there was a variety of ways they did it. But believe me, I was the only human being on the call sheet for a month and a half. It got very lonely. It got to the point where I was missing the good old days on the Death Star.
We're saying that Lee was so enchanted with this film and of the young guys who was going to play with him. We were talking to him in Munich about it, and it sounds like a really great plum role for you, Mark.
Well, I'm a mature grown-up. I mean, of the 4 squad members, if it had been cast, say, 5 years ago, maybe Jeff Bridges would have played my part, and I would have played the kid, which in this one is played by Kelly Ward. But it's unusual simply because Sam Fuller makes such specific sorts of genre films, and he's a breed of director that I'm not going to get much chance to work with anymore. And he has a way of just involving you so much in his enthusiasm that it's really inspiring. And I think it's going to be a contrast because in a big war film as Big Red One is, the moments of humanity that are in it is unusual for a World War II film. And I'm only regret that because of, I don't know, and I'm only an actor and I only read what you read, but it was taken away from Sam Fuller and recut, and it's not the same film that I signed to do. Now, what I have to do is evaluate it could be better than I thought it was supposed to be. I've only seen it one time, and I was so disoriented from, wait a minute, what? That I'm going to have to see it again to really reserve judgment. At this point, all I can say, it was an experience that I was very glad to have been a part of. Lee Marvin, who I was just so scared of working with, turned out to be really supportive, really a kind man. Sam, as I've said, is like no one I've met, and you can't regret, you can't say, gee, I wish I hadn't done it, because a great portion of what I did is out of the movie. But the greatest thing of working about working on it is that each of those incidents were based on Sam's real experiences in World War II. So instead of it being secondhand information, I mean, you hear there's some horrendous thing, I don't know whether it's still in the movie, I can't remember whether this is cut or in, where to get from point A to B, a guy picks up a dead body and uses it as a shield. I said, it's so horrendous, and it sounds it's just as phony as a $3 bill. And Sam will say, well, actually, that's true. It wasn't Johnson who did it. It was actually Vincenzo. He was an Italian guy from Milwaukee. And you're discovering that not only is it true, but Sam saw it happen. And that's what I find just phenomenal. And on top of which, I love all of those fuller touches, shadow shots. He's got the arm of the dead German with the watch showing you how long it took for the invasion of Normandy Beach, and the water keeps getting redder and redder. The French critics are going to be creaming in their jeans.
What about working in Israel for the whole summer on location?
Well, I mean, I don't want to. Emotionally, it was just horrendous for me because they're going through a real war there. I mean, and you see 16-year-old girls out there hitchhiking with the submachine guns. So it was a real emotional judgment to make, because here we are making a war movie in a country that is at war, and that, to have a 16-year-old girl say to you, "What kind of man are you? You've never experienced war." Well, she's right, but that was painful. I don't know if I could say it was a pleasure or not. Okay. Thank you.
It was 14 weeks.
This is Mark Hamill. This is Gary Kurtz, executive producer.
And by the time we had rearranged our schedule completely and kept updating what we were going to do, we kept changing our minds sometimes as we got into the analysis of the sets. Well, what would be best to build now and get over with? We decided we'd have to do the swamp in 7 weeks rather than 14 to actually get it built. So we had to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or the construction crew did, to get that constructed in time. And it wasn't finished when we actually started shooting on the set. We had to start back in the back corner with some of the smaller scenes and work our way out to the tank part where the lake was. So that was probably our single biggest problem with the bog. That, coupled with the fog and the environment, trying to keep it consistent all the time, make the lighting work for both the night, or the daylight, and the night scenes. And of course, it was a real environment. We had ground, and we had water, and we had the river running, and we had animals in there. We had real animals. We had a lot of snakes around. Some of them got away and sort of started inhabiting the set. So birds flew in the end of the soundstage because the doors were so big when they were open to clear the stage. So we found that and then we had a little, because of the grass and dirt that was brought in, we had bugs and spiders and things in the ground. So it sort of became a real place almost.
Long and Perkins is the technical advisor.
When in our magazine we're doing an article about Knox Leavitt, who invented the Westcam mount. You used the Westcam mount in film.
Yes.
Could you tell me anything about the use of that? If it was for, I would imagine, over terrain, the cloud cars.
No, we didn't use it for the cloud cars. We used the Westcam for all of the aerial footage photographed in Norway on the glacier. All of the speeder material, flying, and
searching for
Han Solo, but also the other material, the early material. We first see the Tauntaun riding across the landscape, for instance. Any aerial material. Also plates, background plates for some of the Walker shots.
You used the big globe, did you?
Yes, the big one. Yeah. We had to deactivate the gyroscopic stabilization for the horizon aspect of it, because we wanted. When the helicopter turned, we wanted the banking effect. The Westcam is normally designed so that horizon stays level all the time. We didn't want that.
Gary, just as R2-D2 and C-3PO were the most talked about figures when they made their debut in Star Wars, so too, I'm sure, will Yoda be discussed and loved all over the world. It is mind-boggling to think that there is not a human inside that little figure. We are all used to the Muppets, of course, and this seems to be the ultimate Muppet. Is it giving away any secrets to tell how this character is done? We know it's the voice of Frank Oz, who's Miss Piggy, of course. How's the character done? Is it just a Muppet?
No, not at all. it's a mechanical creature, basically. Some of the movement is done hydraulically, some of it's done mechanically, some of it's done direct human access, and then some of it is done by radio control device. It takes 3 or 4 people to operate Yoda to bring him to life. And the reason we picked Frank Oz originally is not only because he was a puppeteer, but because he's a good actor, and we need the acting relationship with Mark, and also the sense of orchestrating all of the movement. It's one thing to have an actor respond to dialogue and do all of the things that he does facially and with his body that you normally would do, but to try to create that artificially with 3 or 4 people working in synchronization with each other, it's very, very difficult. And that's really what he did. He made all of that happen. And it's not a Muppet at all. Muppet is really just a piece of cloth, and what brings it to life is the personality of the operator, the actor, who's working with it. In this case, we needed that also, but the operation of the character was entirely different, and we needed him to be able to analyze through how it responded to the dialogue and things, how best to deal with all of the various movements of the body.
What brought about the creation of that character? Why did you want to add the character?
Well, it was always in the outline of the Jedi Master being a small, strange creature, but we wanted the personality of the creature to be interesting, to be kind of an irascible old man. That's basically what he is, and it just evolved out of some early sketches and Stuart Freeborn designing the clay models until he came up with one that everyone liked. And as Frank started working with him, some of the quirks of how the character worked came to life, and it was very definitely a collaborative thing to make him actually come alive.
I think one of the neatest effects of Yoda was to see his brow wrinkle. This part right here just move independent of the eyebrows going down, and then this sort of Yoda at the beginning of the scenes, when Yoda enters the scenes, he plays a flibbity-gibbet kind of. Did his voice actually change? I mean, was it
Yeah, there was a conscious effort to change from a light, humorous voice to a much more serious,
and clearer too.
Clearer voice at the end, where he starts training him. He becomes more serious as a character. Really, the early on parts are really. He knows who Luke is from the very beginning. It's really just sort of testing him.
I think the marriage of, dare you say Sesame Street, but I mean the marriage of those people, and with somebody like George it's super that it happened this early in the relationship, because I think the Tauntauns and Yoda are probably. How about the pterodactyls? Were they animated in Dagobah? The flying.
The flying, yes, those are animated.
Gary, in approaching the second part of Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, you always have the sequel. It's become a syndrome in the movie industry. Jaws 1, Jaws 2, Star Wars 1, Star Wars 2. What are the problems from a production standpoint? I don't mean technically, but so that it's not looked at as just an attempt to recreate it, rip it off, go along with the current and milk as much as possible out of it. And doing the second one, and the third one, and the ones to come, what is the overall theory and the problems that you're faced with?
Well, the original idea is that each story furthers the development of the characters properly. And in that sense, we took a risk in that this story is not a carbon copy of the first one, as some sequels have been, and is in fact the second act of the slow movement of the symphony, the second act of a 3-act play, and has a different requirement, a different part of the story to tell. And we focused on each of the stories in that light, what part they play in the saga and how best to tell it, without regard for the fact that possibly it would be easier, simpler, just to do the same film over again and in a different place. That's really the way I feel about the James Bond pictures, is that they have a tendency to be that way, and they're not. You don't learn anything about the characters. You see some really interesting effects and good stunts and things, and they may be temporarily exciting, but you could never they don't fit together in any kind of cohesive manner, and that's really what we wanted. We had to have a continuing story, a real continuing story. That's why I don't like to use the word sequel, because sequel has a bad connotation right now. The dictionary definition of the word is correct. It continues on the story, but I really like to think of it as just the second part of the story.
You were the still photographer on both films.
Well, I took some of the stills. We had a lot of other still photographers.
And also you're the producer. And I know the role of a producer is to make sure that the cash flow follows in reality. But with Lucas as a dreamer and people burning up the midnight oil and industrial light and magic, is it going to get to a point, I mean, I don't quite know how to put this, but I would hate to think that we'd be priced out of, Lucas said earlier that he wanted to make these movies now because the people wouldn't be around in the future that had the taste and the performance to do this. So he wanted to really do a movie of this magnitude to do that. Are we going to price ourselves out of Star Wars sequels, or, I mean...
Well, I don't think so, because the technology that we've been working on, that we worked on all through Star Wars, is to make it less expensive and faster. Because remember, when we started on Star Wars, the general impression from older special effects people in Hollywood was that it was impossible to do in the time that we had allowed. And so we explored remember that 2001 took 5 years to do, and their miniatures are fairly limited, and Stanley never had a computer-based camera to deal with. He was stuck with the technology at that time. Each advance in technology allows you to do more for the same amount of money and time, which I think helps in the future, so that it allows us to get better results at a cheaper price. Now, it may just be keeping up with inflation, so that you're still talking about a slightly more expensive picture, but it does allow you to do things you couldn't do at all before, or couldn't even think about doing. So I think that will help.
But how about the economics of scale, where even with these kinds of technological savings, this movie did cost twice as much
As the first one.
Yeah, and it is a bargain, by current standards, but it still costs $22 million.
Yeah, but that's, part of that is just inflation in the business, the cost of lumber and plastic pipe and film stock and everything else. So if you analyze it against the cost of an average film with no special effects, it's about right for that. Plus we had more sets, longer shooting schedule, and so I'm not really that worried about the exact amount. You're talking about overall, yes. Well, I think it falls into the same category of about is a house that originally sold for $40,000 worth $125 now. It's part of the economic reality of the world. It's still possible to make much smaller films. There are certain kinds of stories that can still be made for $2 or $3 million. But looking at the way the business is now, we made American Graffiti for $750,000, and if that film were made today without any changes at all, it would be $5 million, roughly, almost $5 million.
The common denominator of Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back is pipes. Hallways of pipes out on the plains of the snow. Is that to hide the technical, the power units, or is there a significance?
No, there's not. It's a good visual tool to use for hallways and things. Our approach to spaceships and things is very much like
pragmatic.
Like ships, aircraft carriers and destroyers.
I noticed that Darth's ship was a giant arrow pointing to the watchman or whatever. When viewed from above, it was just a huge arrowhead.
Is there a conscious intent to model some of that technology, say on World War II things, like some of those planes in the Cloud City, look like P-38s or something like that?
No, not so much. It's really the design is partially what looks good and partially what seems believable. The reason that the familiar element, you hit a little bit on it, the idea of using certain things that were familiar from World War II allows you to have things that are fantasy oriented, but with enough of a reality base so that you don't have trouble associating with them.
Will there ever be a dark Star Wars episode? Will there ever be one, say, like a Miles Forman or a Bertolucci that will take it and do something that's...
It's always possible, of course.
Yeah. Do you think George is ever of that ilk, or...?
I don't know. It really depends on where the story is going at that time. You really don't know, and it's interesting to think about what a particular story might be like in the hands of a certain kind of filmmaker.
Is George the only one that knows what the total Journal of the Wills is?
I think so, yeah.
And does
a lot
WHILLS, is that ever explained?
No.
No, it's just a whim.
Are you worried about the criticism that's going to come up? I think that it's not a complete movie, and it's just kind of this serial rather than even an episode.
Well, it is true that the Han Solo part of the story is not resolved, but that was a gamble we had to take because of really the way the story is structured. The principal focus of this story, though, is not on that, and even though that isn't resolved, the main part of the story that we're telling in this episode is Luke's training.
Right, but that's not.
And
you leave us asking a final.
No, but what we resolve in the story, in terms of the principal focus, is the fact that Luke felt that he was capable of confronting Vader and realized that he wasn't, and because
psychologically complete.
Yeah, and because he wasn't adequate for that task is the reason that Han was not saved, basically. And that is all resolved. Or to a great extent, is resolved that he realizes that he has to go back to Yoda to complete his training before he can be a real help. The fact that Han's story wasn't resolved is really impossible to deal with. It was a calculated risk that we had to take to be able to tell the story properly. So that I'm sure there are going to be people who are going to say, well, the tradition of the movies is that everything is resolved.
Can you talk about the great courage and vision of Alan Ladd Jr. before Star Wars was made, when this was first presented by George Lucas and yourself, in going ahead with this and seeing its impact and its potential? It seemed to me there was great heroism involved in that at that time. And what were your beliefs in this project, this trilogy, 3 trilogies actually, that made you guys see that it had such a long time potential as part of the world mythology? What was the inspiration behind it and the faith in it from your own standpoint, and contrary-wise from Ladd's standpoint?
Well, George's original idea in starting it in the first place was based on the fact that there was no contemporary mythology for young people. That's definitely one of the primary focuses of it. The Western really was the last film-oriented mythological base that we had, and space is really the last frontier, and it's really an ideal form to deal with this. The fact that it became unbelievably popular was really a surprise to all of us, and the idea of actually doing a lot of films was only a whim at the time. The idea that there was enough material to do the 9 stories and that it would tell the whole thing, and wouldn't it be nice if, but until the reception of Star Wars, there was no even thought really of pursuing it, except on a one picture at a time basis. Still, that's the case because you have to judge it on the basis of where each one goes.
You were not convinced of its success in the beginning?
Oh, no, not at all. We were shocked, actually, that it did better than... We were fairly well convinced that there was enough of an audience there that it could make its money back. Obviously, you're not going to try anything that doesn't have at least that base to work on. And that if it was a modest success, it could do as well as 2001 did. Beyond that, it was a real surprise.
Was George afraid that it might have some kind of the same cult following that the THX did and not break down?
Well, there is a hardcore science fiction audience, definitely, that will go to almost anything, but that isn't enough of an audience to make it work.
Talk a little bit about how, let's say, the Cloud City next year, that was filmed. Also,
right.
The long passageway that Luke falls down inside.
Okay, let me just finish this part about Laddie. At the time that George first wrote the treatment for Star Wars, it was before American Graffiti had come out, and the 2 studios, United Artists and Universal, had really turned down the idea, mainly because you have to realize that at that time science fiction was not very popular. Everyone thought of 2001 as being very expensive, $11 million in 1967, and and it took a long time to make its money back. So they said, well, science fiction may not be very popular, and this picture has a potential to cost a lot of money, and there are also a lot of special effects. How are the special effects going to be done? There aren't many special effects departments left. So there was a great reluctance on anyone's part to think about it, except to say that it might be too risky. So Laddie was the one that liked the idea of it. He had seen American Graffiti, thought it was a good picture. So they decided to go ahead and develop it on a step deal, which amounts to basically they can bow out anytime they want after they see each step. That's the way most pictures are done. And after the screenplay was delivered to them, American Graffiti had come out and proved to be fairly popular. It wasn't an instant hit. It just did well at the in the box office and stayed in the theater for quite a while. So that meant that after 2 or 3 months it was obviously a hit. Then Fox was more willing to go further step after they saw the drawings and the paintings, and Laddie really liked it, and he fought for it with the board. But it was one of those things where you go and you talk and says, we've got this great picture, it's full of these big furry creatures called Wookiees and little people with glowing eyes called Jawas and things. It was difficult for him to convince them that it might be a viable film project. So I think he really pushed for it, and did us a great service. He really foresaw more than almost anyone else what the potential could be. It was worth the gamble.
Do you feel now this is the new contemporary mythology, that it will replace the Western with the new generations?
Well, for the time being, anyway. I don't think the others are dead. The idea of doing medieval stories or westerns will always continue. There's nothing wrong with any of that. It's just that space as the last frontier is really the imagination of the young people is stimulated by outer space right now, and that ultimately, when we go to Mars, part of that will be created out of the fact that they read Jules Verne or Edgar Rice Burroughs or saw Star Wars or Close Encounters, or all of the space milieu helps to generate interest in that.
Think you'll send a print of Star Wars up to Mars?
Maybe.
What do you have in the future then? Is there any talk about something to do with little dragons or anything?
Well,
about that?
No, not really. Okay. Not yet. Not until... not for a little while. I am working on a picture with Stan Freberg that he's writing. Which could be very fun.
Can you give me any kind of...
No, can't talk about it yet.
Anything like presents the United States of America?
Well, it has that flavor, some of it, but...
Stan
And the next movie in this will come out in 83?
Sometime in 83, yes. Okay. All right, we're ready to go there with one.
Oh, you want it? First, Irvin. What made you want to do The Empire Strikes Back? Space picture, your first space picture. You've always been noted for the characterizations that you've developed in your films. Was this a chance to work with larger-than-life figures and apply that knack of characterization to space figures? What was the reason for doing this film?
Maybe the first consideration was that they were going to pay me. But after we get over that, I always wanted to do fairy tale. Always wanted to do fantasy. Always wanted to talk to children. Communicate with them through a film. I've never had a chance to make a children's film, but I've always dreamed of it. When George came to me with this thing, I thought, a perfect vehicle, because in my mind, it is a fairy tale. People call it a comic strip. It's not a comic strip. It's a fairy tale with all the ingredients of a fairy tale. The mythological ingredients, the unconscious ingredients that make up a fairy tale are here. The fact that it was science fiction or technological on one level had no special appeal for me. That was fine. I would handle that. You learn what you have to learn in order to do it. I certainly pride myself on my technique in film. I was a cameraman. I did my own editing. I've worked in almost every phase of film, and so I wasn't particularly frightened of the technological aspect. But the fact that it was a fairy tale was exciting. And suddenly, here was a chance to do one, and that's why it didn't take me long to make up my mind. The biggest consideration was 2 years of my life or more. It took over 2 years. Starting with working on the script, through the prints coming out of the laboratory, one hell of a lot of work. And did I want 2 years? And I thought, well, if I have a good experience for the 2 years, whether the film is successful or not successful, I've had the 2 years. If I have a bad experience in those 2 years, whether the film is successful or not, I have a bad experience. So assessing George and Gary and their company, I had the hunch that this would be a pretty good learning, healthy experience, and I was totally right, and that's why I did it.
In the luck of ginger coffee, Robert Shaw was which you directed. Robert Shaw was a very pushy Irish immigrant who was in the new country, and Montreal was the place he was going to make it. A lot of Canadians really empathized with that more than they did with Duddy Kravitz, another sort of whatever. That in a way was about a man trying to overachieve. Actually, he just wanted a good bloody job, and he probably would have been good at whatever they had given him a crack at.
Is that true?
Well, maybe not, because
Not true. That's not.
He sort of messed up. I know. I still believe that the character could achieve in the end.
Yes, he could, if he learned to use the Force.
Yes, that's what I was going to.
Which is what he wasn't using. He wasn't using the Force.
He always fought against.
You see, the Force is a metaphor. It's a poetic conception for the power that's in us. That's the only power we have. The power within us. And that's what Robert Shaw in that film, Ginger Coffee, was not using. He was fantasizing, but he wasn't using what he had and what he was. He was not true to himself. He was not an integrated character.
It seemed like every time he rose to the occasion, though, to get to it, a circumstance or something, a phone call or something, broke it down. I mean, instead of, I am a great believer in the Force and Kismet, and not necessarily Kismet, but I don't fight things.
There's nothing metaphysical about it, by the way.
You mean about
the Force?
No.
In my opinion, there's nothing metaphysical. It appears that way to people who have a metaphysical bent. I mean, I heard correspondents in Europe talking to me about the great Christian symbology and about the Force and about the film and all the levels, and I said, yes, I agree with them. That's what they see. But for me, it is, not necessarily a mystical thing. To me, it's really metaphoric and poetic.
When you directed Yoda, did you, in fact, I don't know, I don't think this will offend you, but I find a great similarity between you and Yoda.
Mm-hmm.
I think physically and...
I've been told.
Physically and mentally. I think your attitude is both the unlearned situation and...
to unlearn what you've learned.
Yes.
You've got to do that. It's a Zen position.
Yes.
You have to clean. You have to take the furniture out of a room and create an empty space before you can fill it up again. Before you can take the next step. Pardon?
How did you try to project that? Billy Dee Williams was talking about that you thought it was a Zen position.
Well, it sounds pretentious. I'm not really into Zen on that level. I've read, as many people have read. I've read books on Zen. I love the aesthetic of the thinking. To me, it's just it's just an interest. I don't have a guru. I don't travel to Japan to meet Zen Buddhists, and I also read many books on Christian, early Christian religion. I tried to read the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I read a great deal of them, trying to understand what the Essene culture was. I mean, this is just interest. But I found some of it was applicable here, and I could use some of it, you see.
For sure.
But I wanted this picture to be a communication that the audience could interpret freely. I did not want to make a rigid structure, because in making it rigid, you make it pretentious. If I said, I'm making a picture that's full of symbols and allegory, and this really stands for good and evil and this, you know what? It's pretentious immediately. I wanted things to stand for what they were. This is a bad guy, and this is a good kid, and this is a guy who gave up his life and who still seems to exist on another plane, and this is a bit of a scoundrel who's running around trying to keep himself from giving himself in love or being vulnerable, which is what loving is. I mean, it's things are what they are. Now, you can interpret all you want to according to any system of belief or any structure that you have. And that's why I love this picture, because you can interpret it. And kids, amazingly so, can interpret it. And to give you an example, just on a very simple
How
level.
do kids interpret it?
Well, I told you that my 10-year-old son, David, at the time, David Walden, that I saw the first picture with him. And we talked about it. And he liked it. I mean, he loved it. When I made the second picture, I wanted to try certain sequences out on him because I was cutting the picture as I was shooting. I had my editor with me in England, and we were cutting and sending back certain sequences to George, who was in San Francisco, and he was sort of analyzing it in terms of how we were going to put the special effects on, you see. But I had all my drawings, and he had my drawings, and he got the rushes on black and white that I sent him, a little tape, and I was sending him some of the footage so that they could be planning this better, so we wouldn't be stuck at the end. Now, however, when I showed my son the sequence of Yoda telling Luke to go into the cave, he says, what is there? He says, a domain of evil it is. He says, what's in there? He says, only what you take with you. I showed this sequence to my son. I cut it together. And he says, your weapons, you'll need them not. And the kid looks back and decides that he better take them. Now that's his first error. That means that he's not there yet. He is not a Jedi Knight yet. Now, I said, yeah, and he goes in, and of course now I said, what does a sequence mean to my son, who is now 12 years old, when he was seeing it? He was about between 11 and 12. I said, what does it mean to you, David? He says, well, he's being tested. Right. When he goes into the cave, what does he find? He sees what he fears the most. I said, very good. What does he fear the most? Well, it's Darth Vader. I said, right. Is Darth Vader really there? He says, no, not really. He thinks he's there. It's in his own mind. Right. That's why I was sort of slow motion. He picked that up. I said, great.
Taking a gun in.
Wait. And I said, should he have taken the weapons in? He says, well, if he takes the weapons in, he's going to have to use them. Aha, so therefore he's setting up an assumption, he's setting up a structure that is going to feed back on him, that he's going to have to deal with. If you build an atom bomb, you better deal with the fact that you may have to set it off. And the assumption is, I'm going to have to use it sometime, or you don't build it. Okay, so he goes in there, and I said, now what does it mean when he confronts Darth Vader? Well, what he really would like to do is cut his head off. I said, great. And what does he find? Well, he finds that it's really him. Well, what does that mean? That's kind of silly, isn't it, David? I mean, cut it off and then there. He says, no. It means, and listen to this is a 12-year-old. He said it means that he thought that his greatest fear was Darth Vader. But actually, his greatest fear was himself. Now, if a 12-year-old can do that, then an 8-year-old won't get that, all of that, but they'll sense something. At least it'll be a very exciting scene, you see. And an older person will sort of say, wait a minute, he really wasn't there, and why did they bring the weapon? You got something to think about, something to interpret. And you know what? That's only one interpretation. Only one. Because I heard other ones in Europe.
What are some of the other interpretations?
No, that's up to you to decide what they are for you. I never tell my own interpretation. I'm telling you David's.
That's right.
I didn't tell you mine.
In Europe, I'm talking about.
No, well, that's theirs. You tell me yours. I'm more interested in that.
I agree with David pretty much.
Well, see the picture again, and I'll bet you'll get another one.
When you approached to do the movie, they tell you what they saw in your work that they wanted you to project into the movie?
Absolutely not. George and Gary contacted me. They told me I was the only one they contacted. They knew my work intimately. George and Gary knew all my films. They talked about them. They talked specifically about The Return of a Man Called Horace, which George feels is one of the best Indian pictures ever made. They loved the action sequences that I put into it. They loved the raid on Entebbe. They love ginger coffee. They love loving. George particularly liked Flim Flam Man. And they even remembered Hoodlum Priest.
Little Prince, which was Carrie's.
You say? Which was one of the first all-location pictures.
They're all down there.
That's right. And so they said, and George said to me, he says, I want somebody who under pressure, because there's going to be tremendous pressure, is not going to cave in. And somebody who has a vast experience, a lot of experience in film, and who likes to deal with people, at least likes to deal with characters and people. And I felt very flattered. He knew how to get to me, the rat. And then he says, and I'd like you to do the film. And I said, gee, you want me to do a film where I would follow up and do a sequel to the most successful film ever made? He said, no. He says, it's not a sequel. He said, this is a continuing saga. We're going to make a lot of them. This is really the second part of the saga. There's going to be a third one. They all go together. And I said, most sequels are rip-offs. I made a great film in The Return of a Man Called Horace, and it wasn't appreciated because I learned that a lot of people went to see the first one and really didn't care for it that much because in some ways it wasn't authentic. Was
Return of the Horse, a Man Called Horace?
Yeah.
Where they used the eagle cross?
Yeah.
How in the world is that done?
Well, I can tell you, But anyway, I said, I don't want to do a sequel. He said, well, this is not a sequel. A sequel is often a rip-off. Because a picture makes a lot of money, you now make a second one, you spend less money, and you get that same audience, you take a lot of money in, you see, and then you forget it. I didn't want to do that, nor did I want to do one in which you simply remake the story, like Jaws 2. All they do is make the same story again. I didn't want to do that. Well, when he explained to me that it's a continuing saga, and we talked about the other stories, and the fact that this fits into it, then I began to see that this was the critical picture, the second one. Because if this one developed the characters properly, and if this one became richer than the first, then the third would be wanted, would be needed, that the audience would be waiting for it. If this one was not successful in that way, I'm not talking about money success, if this was not successful, then to make the third one is a gesture of futility.
Why didn't Lucas want to direct it himself, Kirschner?
Different impulse.
He said that it was so difficult to do the first one that he actually said, you're crazy for undertaking this if you undertake it. He said, he says, I couldn't get up in the mornings after a while. 6 months of shooting is very, very hard. And everything goes wrong. And you're dealing with so many elements that you almost can't handle it all, you see. So he said, I don't want to direct anymore. I don't want to direct any more anything. He says, it's just too hard. I said, well, George, you made enough money so you can afford to do what you want to do, and you're right. If other things give you more gratification, you should do other things than direct. I said, what gives me the greatest gratification is directing at this point. Maybe next year, I'll say no, salmon fishing is, but at this year, it's still directing.
Did he go over any ground rules as to the kind of flavor that he wanted to maintain between his and yours?
He's too smart for that. I looked at Star Wars twice. Once with my son before it opened, and the other time after I had said I'll do the picture. Then I never wanted to see it again because I didn't want it to influence me too much. But I retained the image of the first one. Now I went out and chose a cameraman who was different from the first one, and I knew that I would make something that in design would work with the first one and yet be different. And I wanted to develop the riches. I wanted to get away. It was not a comic book for me. It's not a comic strip. To me, it's a very profound film, but not pretentious.
Do you remember what you were saying at this particular point?
I was saying, just don't move because they're taking a still of us. I really can't remember.
Anthony said, if you had nostrils, I'd shove these two fingers.
Kirsch?
That's what I mean by interpretation.
Final thing. And I hope you won't answer by saying whatever you want to take from it. What do you want, the bottom line, the morality play aspect of The Empire Strikes Back to be with the international audience? Obviously, what they want to take. Obviously, people will take their own message from the film. But what do you want to get across?
You see, I don't think there's any one message in this film. I think it is a struggle between good and evil, and I think it's also a rite of passage of growing up.
And a love story.
Well, yeah, but that is the filigree.
I mean
you
a
see.
love story between all the
Yeah, you see, it's a young man growing up. It's a young man learning that there are powers in each of us that have to be developed. That often you're not in a state of readiness to do something. That you can't have what they call instant gratification. That just because you want to do something, you go ahead and do it, and that you'll be successful. That you have to work at things. You got to develop your strengths. That's what he's in the process of doing. And he runs off half-cocked, you see, to do a job that he's not ready to do. And he almost destroys everybody in the process. Instead of sitting quietly and saying, I must reach the point where I can do something. I must weigh the sacrifice of my friends with what I'm doing for the greater good. I must let us try to reach a point where I can do something. In other words, you can't have everything. You can't be all things. And we all have limited strengths, but we don't know what our limitations are.
And you must be responsible for your own
And
actions.
you got to be responsible for your own actions. I mean, there's a lot in here, and that's only a part of it. That's
Does
really
this
only
say,
a part of
does
it.
the Force
Now
say,
remember what he says to him? Vader says to him, hate me. He says, you've conquered your fear, but now, in order to destroy me, use your hate. What has he been warned by? Yoda said, Ben said, don't hate. It's going to weaken you, he's implying. Well, he does get carried away. He could have beaten Vader, probably. But when he got angry, and he began to hate him, he lost the power that he already had.
I'm sorry.
So that's another thing. I mean, there's so much. It just goes on forever. It's infinite in its interpretive possibilities, and that's the charm of it. It's a true fairy tale.